Petersburg.
It was a retired place, shaded by trees, and early spring flowers were opening on nearly every grave. It was so quiet and attractive that he stopped the carriage and walked through it. Mr. Lincoln seemed thoughtful and impressed. He said, "Mary, you are younger than I. You will survive me. When I'm gone, lay my remains in some quiet place like this."
General Lee was riding slowly along the line of tangled wagons. He rode erect, as if incapable of fatigue.
Lee's army fled westward. Grant was right behind him.
On and on, hour after hour, from hilltop to hilltop, the lines were alternately forming, fighting, and retreating, making one almost continuous battle. A boy soldier came running by at the top of his speed. When asked why he was running, he shouted back, "I'm running because I can't fly."
From Danville on April 4th, Jefferson Davis issued a proclamation pledging to fight on.
Relieved from the necessity of guarding city.
Should be all set for you.
All right, let's go. Yeah, I just sold this.
We're gonna be.
All right,
Okay. Be ready. Get ready. Yeah. Good evening. Is this okay? Welcome to the April meeting of the Scottsdale Civil War Roundtable.
not on.
Not on. Okay.
It's going to be turned out.
It's it's on. It's just the sound isn't.
Hello?
Is that better? Okay. One of the other secrets is you got to hold this right to your mouth here. For those of you I have not met, I'm Mark Stoller. I'm president of the Roundtable. I want to introduce somebody who joined us here tonight for the first time, but I've spoken about in an earlier meeting. He is the official historian for the city of Phoenix, Steve Schumacher, if you'd stand up. Thanks for coming. Some of you may know Steve authored an article in the Grape Shot in March on the links between the founders of the city of Phoenix, most of whom were Civil War veterans. Our history discussion group, which is our member facilitated discussion, will take place. Our next one will be on Thursday, April 25th. It's going to be our annual Civil War trivia contest. I think a number of you have participated in the past. It's a lot of fun, very informal and relaxed session. Meeting starts at 6:30. It's at Panera Bread at the intersection of Scottsdale and Indian Road, where they've given us a room to ourselves. Lots of fun. Hope some of you can join us for that. Number of roundtable members recently attended Lincoln Scholar annual Alan Guezel's recent talk in the ASU on what was the Civil War really about. I think the consensus for all of us there was he was an outstanding speaker, really phenomenal in terms of answering questions. At the dinner we had afterwards, he told me he would be interested in speaking to our group. If any of you have seen him on YouTube or anywhere else, he's really a great speaker. If we can combine it with some other engagements in the area, I'm following up with some of the contacts from the dinner at ASU and some of the other institutions that were there who were also trying to arrange something. So we'll see if we can pull off an appearance by him at a later date. As a reminder, the Grape Shot, which usually comes out in the first week of the month, is not going to come out in May until after our May 21st meeting, our final meeting of the season. That will include the information on our annual contributions to battlefield preservation. So you'll see that information at that point in time. And we'll also be announcing all that at the meeting on May 21st. I wanted to mention, we've had in the past 2 issues, I think we've mentioned Boot Hill Books. Is James Becker here in the back, who operates Boot Hill Books in Gilbert? And I just wanted to mention, they actually, for those of you familiar, purchased the inventory of the Guidon Bookstore in Scottsdale, which was the leading Civil War and Western history bookstore in the Phoenix area. They are open on Saturdays, and this weekend they'll be open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in Gilbert. There'll be a discount for Civil War Roundtable members and a 20% contribution to all proceeds to the American Battlefield Trust. There are flyers outside on that, or you can look at the recent Grape Shot newsletter, which will have the information on where they're located. Also wanted to mention, before our program chair, David Ward, introduces the speaker, that David Ward is going to be assigned or reassigned to activities in the Eastern Theater of War after the end of this season. And so as of May, he will no longer be the program chair. He will be serving, he'll be back here, so you'll see him. He'll be serving as a continuing advisor to the Roundtable, and he leaves us in good hands. We have a full season slate for the 2024-25 season, and I really wanted to thank him and acknowledge the terrific job he's done as program chair. Our new program chair who will be taking over when David leaves in May is John Taylor. And John, where are you? If you would stand up, you'll be seeing a lot of him coming forward. And with that, I'll introduce David, who can introduce the speaker. Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark, and good evening, everyone. And it's always good to see a room full of Civil Warriors, especially on a night when we can campaign and get rambunctious with Mosby's Raiders. Civil War personalities have long attracted the interest of academic historians, scholars of the era, and of course, Americans from all points of the compass. George Armstrong Custer. And then there's another George, Brinton McClellan, Stonewall Jackson, Nathan Bedford Forrest, that pyromaniac from Ohio, William Tecumseh Sherman. They all have devoted followers and detractors. Custer and McClellan for their braggadocio, Jackson and Forrest for their eye-popping success on the battlefield, and Sherman for burning the South to a crisp. Another man, however, is often admired by many and scorned by a few for his pluck, daring, and audacity. That fellow was a slender, wiry, unassuming, highly educated fellow from Virginia. No, it's not R.E. Lee, but rather John Singleton Mosby, a lawyer by trade, but a man who left an indelible mark on the Civil War through his daring raids and hair-raising adventures. Mosby has attracted the interest of a host of historians: Virgil Carrington, Pat Jones, James Ramage, Kevin Seipel, and a good friend of mine, Jeff Wirt, just to name a few. They've all authored biographies of the famous Gray Ghost. Mosby, too, authored his own exciting memoir titled The Memoirs of Colonel John S. Mosby. Despite all of his escapades, however, the question still lingers in the minds of many. Where does the Mosby legend end and the man and the soldier begin? Well, we're fortunate tonight to have with us the foremost expert on Mosby and his Confederacy, a fellow who actually makes his home in the heart of Mosby's Confederacy, Eric Buckland. Having written extensively on Mosby and his raiders, it's a pleasure to have him with us tonight to tell us about the facts, myths, and legends surrounding Colonel Mosby and his infamous raiders of the 43rd Virginia Battalion. Please welcome Eric Buckland.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me. We'll see if how you feel about David when I'm done with this presentation and whether or not he made a good choice or not. But as he said, tonight I'll be talking about Mosby's Rangers, facts, myths, and legends. I've probably given 100 talks on the Rangers, and so I know some of the questions that normally pop up at some time after the presentation. I hope to address some of those in the body of my presentation and hopefully clarify possibly some confusion or maybe some things you don't know about the Rangers, and just try to set the record straight as best I can. Now, a show of hands. This is group participation. How many have heard of Mosby's Rangers? Second part of that question. How many believe that Mosby's Rangers were nothing more than murderers, cutthroats, and horse thieves? And some of you aren't raising your hands are liars. And I ask that because normally I talk to sons of Confederate veteran camps around Virginia, Maryland, maybe into North Carolina, or to United Daughters of the Confederacy chapters, and obviously Mosby will be on the good guy list. But it's been interesting a few times to go into the belly of the beast a little bit in the north to find that there are people who have different opinions. My premise is, or my thesis statement is, that Mosby's Rangers was a very effective, relatively disciplined unit. Now, I come from this from a professional standpoint. I spent 22 years in the Army. 15 years of those 22 years were in Special Forces. So I'm fascinated by special operations and the history of special units, starting back probably with Rogers Rangers at least. And so I've come to appreciate what made up a good unit and what made up a poor unit. I'm a Yankee, as all my SCV friends like to remind me pretty frequently. I was born in Kansas but raised in Connecticut. I had one ancestor who fought in a Connecticut regiment, an infantry regiment. I think he was in the unit for about 6 months, and then they said, "Would you please go home?" And that was the end of his tour of duty. So great-great-grandpap did not ride with the Rangers. I'm just very interested in the way they operated. And as David said, I lived very close to Mosby's Confederacy. And I started my deep dive when my youngest son was a rat or a freshman at Virginia Military Institute. That's about the same time, that was 2006, about the same time that I had begun to read about the Rangers. And I came to realize very quickly that there were 57 men who attended VMI at one time or another. The majority of them left VMI to join Mosby during the war. but a few had graduated before, and a few actually before the war, and a few actually rode with Mosby and then went to VMI. So I did a deep dive into those 57 men, really to honor my son to a certain extent, and I found that their lives were so compelling, and that many of those men were so similar to the men that I served with in Special Forces that I just continued on with it, to the point now where I have decent research in my 8 books on 450 different men. And that's really where I've come to this conclusion that this was a good unit. And as far as some of the other accusations, I will address some of those as we go along. You will see in this picture, just for your edification, that's a photo of Ranger Andrew Binney Mitchell. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the only photo in existence, or at least that I have ever seen, of a ranger in his go-to-work clothes. That is a ranger mounted on his horse in Warrenton before the end of the war, and looking very much probably as he would have before he went out on a raid. I think, again, it's you get a feeling, I think, for the personality of that man just in that photo. How many of you are familiar with this quote? I think there's one person in the audience who knows what it is, but I'm going to ignore him and not ask for any of his input whatsoever. No one knows this quote. As glides and sees the shark, rides Mosby through green dark. It was written by some hack named Herman Melville. Moby Dick had been published in 1851, I believe. Melville was not having good success with it. He decided he was going to become the poet laureate of the Civil War and finagled his way into a Union cavalry camp. He had good friends in this unit and wrote about a particular raid that went into Mosby's Confederacy, which was virtually Northern Virginia, and wrote about the raid that this Union unit made into Mosby's Confederacy. And from start to finish, it's an epic poem. It's 15, 16, 17 pages long. From start to finish, it talks about Mosby and how badly Mosby and his men had gotten into the minds of the Union cavalry. He was this specter. He was an aura. He was a ghost. He was a threatening ghost. And the full text of the poem, The Scout Toward Aldie, is in the book that I have here tonight. But right from the front, here's someone that Mosby had captured this man's imagination, and Herman Melville would write a poem about him and his Rangers. Who were the Rangers? Very quickly, developed, organized, and commanded by John Singleton Mosby. They were Confederate Partisan Rangers. They operated from January 1863 until they disbanded on 21 April 1865. Their primary AO was Northern Virginia, Loudoun, Fauquier, Warren, and Clark counties. That would become known as Mosby's Confederacy. They did operate, however, into Fairfax County more than almost all those other counties combined, because Fairfax County was a target-rich environment, and that's where they could cause a lot of trouble. Mosby started his operations early January 63 with 9 men who were loaned to him from Jeb Stuart. By April 65, at least, and this number often surprises people, by April 1865, at least 800 men had been officially mustered into Mosby's Rangers. And that encompassed companies A all the way through H of the 43rd Battalion Virginia Cavalry. Almost 2,000 men, including those 800 men, rode with Mosby at one time or another. And those of us who research the Rangers in depth consider anyone who rode on a raid with Mosby to have been a Mosby Ranger. And those other 1,200 men or so were made up of fathers who wanted to come check on their young sons to make sure they were okay, riding with Mosby. Big brothers who usually came from some other unit to check on their little brothers. Many small detachments of Confederate cavalry threw in with the Rangers for a raid or two. Confederate cavalrymen especially who'd been wounded, gone home to heal up, and wanted to return, were ready to return to their units, would ride with Mosby in hopes of getting a horse or a saddle or whatever other equipment they needed. There were also several men who rode with Mosby once or twice that Mosby, without question, threw out of the unit. They were cowards, they were skulkers, they didn't behave properly. He would just tell them to leave the unit. And there were also a good number of men who would ride on a raid or two and decided that they just didn't like the way that Mosby operated, behind lines, constantly a constant threat, and they would say, that's all, I don't want to do any more. But almost 2,000 men would be with Mosby at one time or another. John Singleton Mosby, as I said, he developed the idea of the Rangers. He didn't invent guerrilla warfare, but he came up with the idea of his unit, and he formed them and he led them from start to finish. Now, John Mosby was called probably many things during the war, especially by Union authorities, but he was never called the Gray Ghost during the war. And I know people constantly talk about that. I have found absolutely no sign that he was ever referred to as the Gray Ghost until I believe about 1958 when the TV program came out. Contrary to popular belief, to a certain extent, especially up in Loudoun and Fauquier counties, those are in Northern Virginia, Mosby did not sleep in each and every house that was existing then in Loudoun and Fauquier County. Sort of, I come from Connecticut. There were every house there that dated back to the times of George Washington, the Revolutionary War. George Washington slept in every one of those homes. It's the same thing of Loudoun and Fauquier. He slept in every house, and in half of those houses, he was almost captured by Union troopers. And in a third of those houses, he had ridden his horse into the house, up the stairs to the second floor of the house, and then hidden his horse in the attic. That's sort of the standing story. Didn't happen. He might have met George Patton when they were both living in California. When Mosby was a little bit older by that time, Patton would have been young up until his teen years. It's possible that they did meet. It's possible that they maybe even spent a little bit of time together. But many people have taken that story of the possibility that Mosby and Patton met and spent a little time together, have taken that story to the extent that Mosby taught Patton everything he knew about armor warfare, and that had it not been for John Mosby, the United States would not have won in Europe. The truth is, they probably met, and that's really about the extent of that relationship. There is no Mosby's treasure. All of you with your tickets back to Virginia, just turn them in, okay? There's no Mosby's treasure. And I still get phone calls periodically that there's millions of dollars in gold and jewels that he had taken possibly on the raid into Fairfax Courthouse or on different times, and they know where it is. It's between two trees. It's between two trees, and if you can find those two trees, you'll find the treasure. The bad thing, I think the worst thing about the story, there's one real basic story to Mosby's treasure. It's taken 2 or 3 or 4 different events having to do with the Rangers and crumpled them all together to come up with the story of the treasure. There just isn't one. And you may not realize it or not, but John Mosby was all but penniless when he died. Almost destitute. Had it not been for some of the Rangers who did very well after the war, John Mosby would have been in dire, dire financial straits. Had there been a treasure, you think he might have gone back and retrieved it. There is no treasure. Mosby and Grant were friends, but Mosby never served in either of Grant's administrations. He did not serve in his administrations. And in fact, when Mosby would become the U.S. consul to Hong Kong, he was appointed by Rutherford B. Hayes. He was not appointed by Grant. By the time Mosby was appointed to that position, which he held for 7 years, Grant had left office and Hayes had followed him into the presidency. Many people like to say that Mosby learned everything there was to learn from Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. And that really intrigued me when I read it a few times. And Mosby does talk about, as a youth, reading a book or reading about Francis Marion and whooping with delight when he would read how Marion would beat the British soldiers. I went back to find what books were available at that time in the 1840s, mostly the late 1830s, 1840s, when Mosby was a child. And the only books that were available told stories about Marion, but they certainly were not a how-to book. It was no guide to being a successful guerrilla. Mosby, in reality, had a knack. He just got unconventional warfare. He understood it, and whatever he accomplished, some by making mistakes and learning from them, but in most cases, he just knew how to operate as an unconventional warrior. He just simply understood it. But it wasn't because he had read these books about how Francis Marion did things step by step by step. Mosby and hence the Rangers had a very unique chain of command. From the very beginning of January of 1863 until the end, Mosby understood what he was going to do. In general, my purpose was to threaten and harass the enemy on the border. If you can see from the map here, you see the sort of explosions. That would be the area where Mosby operated. To his east would have been the forts around Washington City, the picket posts and the forts. Those picket posts or cavalry vedettes pushed out into at least western Fairfax County. Mosby wanted to wreak as much havoc as he could against those outposts and those vedettes. His idea was the Union would have to react, and they would pull troops from the main battle area to the south, as you can see, where Lee was fighting the Union Army, or they would pull back. So he understood what it was he was supposed to do. He never intended to meet a force head on head in a normal, regular cavalry type of attack. His chain of command, initially, he reported directly to Jeb Stuart. That was his commander, if you will. When Stuart was mortally wounded, subsequently died from Yellow Tavern, Mosby reported directly to Robert E. Lee. And that was his chain of command from start to finish. Mosby formed this unit, brought the unit together under the auspices of the Partisan Ranger Act, which was passed in April of 1862. This was one of many attempts by the Confederate government to keep men in the Confederate Army. And the Partisan Ranger Act said that units could be formed, be they artillery, infantry, or cavalry, and they were almost always cavalry. These units could be formed where officers would be duly commissioned, men would be paid the same as regular Confederate soldiers. They would be a formal part
of the Confederate Army, and everything would be on the same line as a regular Confederate unit, with one noted exception. If you were in a Partisan Ranger unit, anything you took on a raid, you could keep. If you didn't want it, you could sell it back to the Confederate government for profit. So think privateers. Mosby knew that would be a tremendous recruiting tool. He also knew that once men got into the unit and got a little taste of that. This is not to reflect on how patriotic or loyal or dedicated these men were. He just knew this was a good deal. And once they got into the unit, he knew they would want to behave. So there wasn't an iron fist that ruled that unit. There was almost above and beyond everything else, the Partisan Ranger Act, which brought men in and then kept men in. They wanted to behave because Mosby had absolutely no problem dismissing men summarily from the unit if they could not behave in the proper way. And because of this Partisan Ranger Act, the Rangers, again, almost from start to very finish, used the United States government, the U.S. Army, as their their supply chain. That's where they got their horses. That's where they got their weapons. That's where they got tack for the horses. That's how they could replenish almost everything they needed because of the Partisan Ranger Act. The reality is the Partisan Ranger Act, as you might imagine, became an open invitation to thugs and brigands. And in many cases, this idea of the Partisan Ranger Act was abused by many small groups of Southern men who preyed as much on Southern civilians as they did on Union soldiers. And it became a real draw to a certain extent on the Confederate Army because everyone wanted to be with one of these units. They were very, very lax. And often they were they would operate very close to home. And so the Confederate Army saw in the end that this Partisan Ranger Act wasn't working. It wasn't a good idea. And about a year after it was passed, it was actually revoked. And the order went out that anyone in one of these Partisan Ranger Acts or Partisan Ranger units needs to find the nearest regular Confederate unit and muster into that unit, except for two units, Mosby's Rangers and McNeil's Rangers, who operated in the Valley. Both of those units were allowed to continue on as Partisan Rangers and could continue to keep the loot or whatever else they would take on raids. And that was absolutely a recognition of the fact that those two units, Mosby's and McNeil's, were effective, they were efficient, and they were fairly well disciplined, that their officers kept them in check, and the depredations that many of these other groups were conducting on Southern civilians were not happening with Mosby's Rangers. But again, the Partisan Ranger Act was a huge reason for Mosby being able to draw men in almost absolutely up until the day that the unit disbanded in April of 1865. And because of that, because of the Partisan Ranger Act, and because of these different people that were drawn to the unit, you had what a newspaper article referred to as the famous aggregation of daredevils. And those were the men who rode with Mosby's Rangers. And as I said at the start, I've been researching the men for 15 years or so. The average age was probably 19 or 20. He had 14, 15-year-olds, 16. There were some older men as well. The average age, again, is probably 18, 19, 20. So it was a younger group in this unit. But out of that, those men who rode with him, the number of lawyers, doctors, ministers, law enforcement, lawmen, and millionaires who came out of that unit is pretty exceptional. But during the time with Mosby, This was a dashing, daring group of young men with a little bit of swagger and certainly a feeling of invincibility. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the Partisan Ranger Act was being used and it was drawing people into the unit. And because of that, one of my favorite quotes, written by John Munson, who wrote Reminiscences of a Mosby Guerrilla. One of the quotes in there was, "It was an unwritten law of the regiment that when a Mosby man heard of Yankees in the neighborhood, he should immediately go after them, learn all that he could, report to such other of his comrades as he could reach, and then start something." And I like that. That encapsulates, I believe, the Rangers' mentality. Stick your nose in it. And friends, when the Rangers had fights, they were almost always outnumbered. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to 1. It didn't matter. They would start fights with those odds, banking on surprise and some other things. But there was that idea to, again, as Munson would state, to start something. And some of that comes from the fact that there was a thing called the Ranger Telegraph, that I call the Ranger Telegraph, that I'll explain. The Rangers stayed in what they called safe houses. They did not have any kind of permanent camp. The only time they'd get anywhere close to something that resembled a camp was maybe on the move, when they might stop for a few hours to take a quick nap, or a couple other temporary camps that they had where they were holding Union prisoners, trying to get them through the lines to regular Confederate units, or maybe they'd captured a lot of horses and they couldn't move them right away. But there were no permanent camps. There were safe houses up in Loudoun and Fauquier County. The houses belonged to mom and dad, as far as the Rangers were concerned, or aunts and uncles. In some cases, the houses were the Ranger, who the Ranger was staying in, was his house, where his family was. And then other Rangers would pile into those different houses with their comrades. When I was a second lieutenant in the 101st, my first company commander was a guy, or first company first sergeant was a guy named Ed Soik. And on Friday afternoons, he'd gather all the troopers in the company and give them his safety briefing, if you will. Most of it I can't repeat here, but he would normally at some point say to the troopers, "If you have nothing to do here, or if you have nothing to do, don't do it here." And that was Mosby's feeling. Mosby was a private at the beginning of the war. He hated camp life. He hated all the drudgery of the military. And so if you were off, you were off. You go to your safe house, and that's where you stay until you're needed. And he expected all of the men staying in these homes to behave like gentlemen. And to cut it to the chase, that means act the same way you would act in front of your mother, your sisters, or your wife or your girlfriend. And if you didn't, and there were cases where men didn't, Mosby would dismiss them from the unit. After the Rangers would go on a raid, before they would go back to their safe house, whoever ran that raid would tell his men, "We will meet at such and such a place in 2 days." They'd go off to their safe house. And if nothing happened, they would be expected to be at such and such a place in 2 days. However, because of all the Rangers knew where other Rangers were staying, if a Ranger was out and he saw a Union patrol, he would ride to the nearest safe house, let those Rangers know, "We've got a Union patrol." And one of those Rangers would ride to the next house, and it would go on and on and on. That's sort of the Ranger Telegraph. And very slowly, more and more Rangers. They would be told there's Union troopers at such and such a place, begin to move there, and the Rangers would slowly make their way to where this Union patrol was. And time again, when you read about Ranger fights, you'll see where there's an initial contact between a small body of Rangers and Union troopers, and then 5 minutes later, there's 10 more Rangers there. A few minutes later, there's 15 more, and they would continue to pile on. The Union Cavalry started to realize that that's what's going to happen. When a fight starts, these Rangers are going to keep piling on. And so again, it's that get out there, start something, and then it will continue from there. So you had Rangers with the telegraph, as you will, if you will, telling other Rangers, go to such and such a place. And then it was simply this riding to the sound of guns. If you were in your safe house and you heard gunfire, there was an expectation that you would mount up and ride to the sound of the guns. So that's how the safe houses would work, as far as kept the men occupied to a certain extent. They were not doing drudgery, but they could react pretty quickly whenever they were alerted, either by the telegraph or by gunfire. Initially, Union authorities, Union troopers had no idea where the Rangers were staying. They actually were looking for camps. They couldn't find them. They began to realize, okay, the Rangers are in private homes. They're in these safe houses. And so they started to conduct patrols. And they'd roll into these houses late at night, early morning. And they caught some Rangers in bed. Most of the Rangers got smart and understood, okay, I'll eat my dinner in the safe house. We'll sit by the fire. Maybe we'll have a song, a little dance, whatever it might be. And then they would mount up and they'd ride, in a lot of cases, up into the Blue Ridge or into some little holler where they had a lean-to. And they'd spend the night out in the elements away from the safe house. And then the next morning, all clear, they'd mount up and ride back to the safe house for breakfast. And that's really how those safe houses worked. Some of the men paid rent. Others would share things that were captured with the people they stayed with. You see the picture of the young lady in the middle. The Rangers, for lack of a better word, were rock stars of the day. These were dashing young men. And of course, all the young ladies would swoon over them. Again, 17, 18, 19-year-old, these, in many cases, good-looking, well-dressed guys. Again, the dashing cavaliers of Northern Virginia. Several Rangers had more than one fiancée in the area. And several young ladies had more than one fiancée in the area, too. It was quite a friendly area. The number of Rangers who married women or young ladies from the safe houses or down the street, or the sisters or cousins of other Rangers, is pretty extraordinary. And a lot of that would bubble up on this off time in between these operations. Uniforms. Mosby's standing order was you will wear something gray. That's it. When you go out on operation, something gray. Whatever that might be. Blouse, a hat, trousers, pants, whatever, something gray. Many accounts from the Union say that Mosby's men were wearing Union uniforms. And that's how they were able to get the drop, get the bulge, surprise the Union troopers during an attack. I went back and checked a lot of those accounts again, and funny, it was only the accounts where the Union troopers were soundly drubbed. Suddenly, Mosby's men were wearing uniforms. I don't believe they did. Every single account written by a Ranger that I've read denies the fact that they wore Union uniforms. And most of the things written by the Rangers are pretty honest, warts and all. talk about bad things, they talk about good things. I don't believe the Rangers rode around in Union uniforms. They did wear, some wore Union overcoats when it was cold. And of course, they all wore ponchos when it was raining. But as far as wearing the blue, putting on a full Union uniform, I don't believe it ever happened. And finally, a lot of people talk about this, have mentioned this to me over the years. There was no blending into the population. This group of men, Mosby's Rangers, were not farmers by day and fighters by night. You know, a lot of that kind of comes from what we know from Vietnam. That wasn't the case. In Northern Virginia, especially after Mosby had started his operations, even as early February '63, if you were a young male, and let's say from 14 to probably close to 60, if you were a young Southern male or a Southern male standing on the streets of Middleburg, Virginia, when a Union patrol came by, you were going to be stopped. You were going to be questioned, and you were possibly going to be arrested and taken back to the cavalry camp from where the Union troopers had come. Mosby's Rangers stayed out of the way of Union cavalry until they could get in a position where they could start a fight. And that's the reality. So it was not the Union patrol driving down or riding down one of the back roads, seeing a 17-year-old man plowing a field who would wave to them. That didn't happen. So the idea of them hiding in plain sight just isn't true. It doesn't hold water. Treatment of Union prisoners. This is another one that has been perpetuated, that Mosby killed all of his prisoners. The reality is, that initially, when Mosby started his operations with those 9 men, even as the unit grew a little bit, they would take the men from wherever they captured the Union troopers, and they would take them away from that fight and parole them as quickly as they possibly could. And that, in fact, caused a problem for the Rangers early on, because they tended to bring prisoners back from Fairfax County, which again is part of Northern Virginia, into Loudoun County to the little town of Middleburg. And that's where they would parole the Union prisoners. And they did it so often that a threat was made to the mayor of Middleburg that if you don't quit supporting Mosby's Rangers, we're going to burn your town down. Because they believed that was the headquarters for Mosby's Rangers. So early on, Union prisoners would be paroled for subsequent exchange. Later, when the whole paroling and exchanging system really kind of stopped, the Rangers would take prisoners, they would hold them until they could get them to regular Confederate units where they would be passed on to POW camps. And it is true that a good number of the Union soldiers that Mosby's men captured would die in the Andersonville prison. Union wounded were treated to the best of the Rangers' ability. They always had 1 or 2 doctors in the unit. Some fought. In fact, all of them did. It was only later that one doctor was really almost a pure surgeon. But the Rangers would take care of those Union wounded as best they could. If they were just slightly wounded, they'd normally be taken away as a prisoner. If they were badly wounded, they'd do what they could for them and then leave them, because they knew Union troops would be coming on to follow up this fight. Executions by the Rangers were rare. There was a case in, I believe, August of '64, when a detachment of Rangers rode down on a group of Union house burners. They'd already burned 2 houses, not the barns, not the mills. They burned those too, but the homes as well, and turned the families out. And by the time the Rangers caught up with this group of house burners at the 3rd house, they rode down on them and they killed every single one of them. You can call it murder if you want. It was pretty darn close to that. And in that case, they did execute those men for burning houses. The only other notable exception to the non-executions was what happened after 6 Rangers who were summarily executed in Front Royal on September 23rd, 1864. A 7th would be executed again summarily about 3 weeks later. Mosby would hold a death lottery to select 7 Union soldiers to be executed in retaliation. War crime today, absolutely, but that back then, what they called retaliation in kind was legal. You could do that. So the idea of Mosby and his men wantonly executing all prisoners is just not true. Again, the Rangers who wrote books and stories about their activities were always pretty honest in everything that they said and what the Rangers did. So this wanton execution of Union troopers, just not true. One of the things that led to Mosby's success was the fact that he operated in an area that became known as the debatable land, especially Loudoun and Fauquier County. There was never a permanent presence other than Mosby and his men the last 2 years of the war. There was never a permanent presence of northern or southern troops in that area. And so it was almost what special operations today would call, if not a permissive environment, certainly semi-permissive. They had the freedom. Mosby and his men had great freedom to move about in that area that became known as Mosby's Confederacy. I've seen many people say if only the South had replicated what Mosby did all over the South, they would have won. It wouldn't have happened. I honestly believe that the situation where Mosby was, Mosby himself, and then the situation where they were, the threat or lack thereof, the support of the people, the terrain, all those things combined gave Mosby the opportunity to be successful. I don't know that that could have been replicated throughout the South, maybe in a couple other places, but I think a lot of the success of the unit actually goes back simply to John Mosby himself. And I don't know how many other Mosbys there were riding around in the Southern Army. So the idea of replicating throughout these guerrilla units, working with the same efficiency that Mosby did, I don't think it was possible. Mosby made a great effort to continually gather information and sometimes intelligence on what the enemy was doing, where they were, how large a unit was, where they were going. And intelligence and information played a critical role, again, for the success that the Rangers had. And one of the reasons they were so effective is they normally got the drop on Union forces in the area. Why? Because they were essentially playing in their own backyards. They were, in some cases, literally operating and fighting in their own backyards. And Mosby would pick certain men who he knew areas of Mosby's Confederacy literally like the back of their hands, and those would be his primary scouts and guides. Mosby himself, again, John Munson, who wrote Reminiscences of a Mosby Guerrilla, would talk about Mosby being one of the fastest and most efficient scouters in the unit. He said it was not rare for Mosby to go out on a 30 or 40 mile ride scouting. Where's the enemy? What are they doing? What might they do? Come back from that scout, have a cup of coffee, change horses, and go out again. So intelligence and the information for the Rangers was critical. And again, that's one of the reasons for their success in most cases. When Mosby didn't pay as much attention to a target or an operation as he should have, didn't have enough information, didn't have correct intelligence, or started to speed things up a little bit, he paid the price. And it happened 2 or 3 or 4 times where he would get a little sloppy in what he was doing and wasn't sure exactly what he was getting into, and he would pay the price. Today's Special Operations Forces, especially Army Special Forces, talks about the people in those units being specially selected, specially trained, and specially equipped. And that flips over to Mosby's Rangers to a certain extent. What really made them successful was surprise, speed, violence of action, and superior firepower. The weapon of choice, the tool of the trade, was the revolver for the Rangers. In most cases, it was a Colt because that's what they could capture from the Union troopers. And the Rangers would go into fights with anywhere from 2 to 6 revolvers apiece. And that's a lot of firepower. They were also very well mounted and they could ride well. When you joined Mosby's Rangers, you had to bring your own horse. But then the Rangers would capture more horses. As a Partisan Ranger, they could keep a horse they captured, and the Rangers could continually rotate their horses out. So they would get up against a Union unit whose horses were worn out and tired. The Rangers would be on fresh mounts. That's how they could get the jump and get the bulge on Union units many times, just because the horses were so fresh and ready to go, and because the Rangers, in most cases, were better riders than the Union soldiers were. And again, the riding down with those revolvers. And they did not attack in these wonderful columns of 4, as you see in the movies. The Rangers would attack like an angry swarm of hornets. Those pistols would be out, and some of them talk about reins in their teeth, a la John Wayne in whatever that movie was, a revolver in each hand going to work. And they'd pick one target and go to the next one. It was very difficult for the Union cavalry to stand up against that kind of violence, that kind of firepower when they would be hit. From January until June 10th, Mosby's Rangers were just literally a bunch of guys. They had no formal title. Mosby himself called this band of men Mosby's conglomerates. And it wasn't until the 10th of June that he had gotten permission to formally form the 43rd Battalion, Virginia Cavalry. But prior to him doing that, he got a couple of direct orders from Jeb Stuart, to whom he was still reporting, still his mentor. And Stuart would tell him, don't call yourself Mosby's Rangers. Call the unit Mosby's Regulars. Well, we know how that went. He also said, you will conduct elections, because that's one of the privileges Confederate soldiers have been given. They could elect their own officers up to at least regimental level. They could vote for those men who they wanted to lead them. So those were the 2 orders that Mosby had from Jeb Stuart. And on the 10th of June, John Mosby would bring these 4 men, James Willie Foster, William Thomas Turner, known as Tom Turner, William Lyle Hunter, and George Whitescarver, would bring them to this house in the front parlor, Caleb Rector House, bring them in, they weren't sure why, and lead them into the front parlor and have them sit down. And once they would sit down, he would say, here, sign these. And they were commissioning papers. Foster would be made captain and company commander of Company A. Tom Turner, first lieutenant. William Lyle Hunter, second lieutenant. George Whitescarver, third lieutenant. Again, of Company A, 43rd Battalion, Virginia Cavalry. What hadn't happened There hadn't been an election, but we already have the officers for A Company. It's a second order that Mosby said, oh, yes, sir, I'll do that, and didn't do it. And that would become something that Mosby did every time a new company would be formed. Company A all the way through Company H. In this particular case, Mosby had those men sign their commissioning papers. They would mount up, they'd ride maybe 3/4 of a mile to this building. It's a stone field or a fieldstone schoolhouse that still stands. He would bring those 4 men with him. All the other Rangers who were going to be formed into Company A were there waiting. They all knew something was up. They weren't sure what. And Mosby called them up and said, gentlemen, we're forming Company A of the 43rd Battalion. I am now opening the floor to nominations for your officers. As soon as he opened the floor to nominations, he read his list. Those 4 men closed nominations and asked for a vote. Now there was actually some pushback. There were some other men that some of the Rangers thought maybe should have been in the running, and then some of the men who received rank, people thought that might be a little bit different. And Mosby told the group, that's my slate of officers. Those are your company officers. If you don't like it, you can leave. You can go back to Lee's army. And nobody took him up on it. And from that time until the very end, all officers in the 43rd would be handpicked by John Mosby. Many of the non-commissioned officers as well. What I really admire about Mosby in this case is there was no favoritism. There were men with whom he was very good friends who never made rank. There were others who maybe made lieutenant, but they never got companies. It was based, his selection of officers and even then NCOs was based on merit and merit alone. That's another reason the unit was, I believe, so successful. It's another fact. Some of these facts, and that's one of the great things about the Rangers, is some of the stories about their fights and some of the things they did and the personalities of some of these men are so extraordinary that if you were to put it in a movie, people would say, oh, that's bogus. And that's one of the things about the Rangers is you don't have to embellish. You don't have to make things up. You don't need the myths and the legends because the reality, the facts are good enough. They're enough to hold you enthralled, at least me, for 15 years. Many people have asked about Quantrill vis-a-vis, or how do Mosby and Quantrill compare? This is my answer. Quantrill's Raiders in Missouri, the Missouri Bushwhackers. I've read a lot about them, a lot of interesting people, but in my mind, the border war, Kansas and Missouri especially, was a blood feud on LSD, steroids, and speed. It was all about killing people with maybe or no reason whatsoever other than he was on the wrong side. Mosby was operated at least at an operational level, possibly at a strategic level a few times, fought with a little more chivalry, would pass intelligence to Stuart and then later to Lee, two separate and distinct, I believe, ways of fighting. And I see really no, other than the fact that both units rode horses, I don't see much comparison between the two units. Mosby would disband his unit on the 21st of April, 1865, rather than surrender it. After he disbanded the unit, 2 or 3, maybe even as many as 400 of the Rangers would ride to Winchester and get their paroles. Mosby would take a small group of Rangers and try to get down to North Carolina to link up with Joseph Johnston because Mosby wanted to continue to fight. But before he could even get close, he would find out that Johnston had surrendered as well. And that would be the end of Mosby's Rangers, with that disbanding rather than a formal surrender to Union authorities. Later on, Ulysses Grant would write, there were probably but few men in the South who could have commanded successfully a separate detachment in the rear of an opposing army. This is talking about Mosby. And so near the border of hostilities, as long as he did without losing his entire command. That's a pretty nice compliment from the man who at one point in 1864 sent a message to Phil Sheridan that said, whenever you find any of Mosby's men, hang them. He pulled that order back almost immediately, but he sent it. That's a pretty nice compliment from Grant. In 1992, John Singleton Mosby was inducted into the United States Army Ranger Hall of Fame. Colonel John S. Mosby, Confederate States Army, was inducted into the Army Ranger Hall of Fame. And it was the first class inducted into the Hall of Fame, Fort Benning, Georgia, now Fort Moore, I think it's called. In that class were Robert Rogers of Rogers Rangers, James Rutter, who was a Ranger Battalion commander in World War II, Frank Merrill of Merrill's Marauders, William O. Darby, who commanded the first modern-day Ranger Battalion in World War II, and Arthur D. Simons, who was in the 6th Ranger Battalion in the Pacific during World War II, and later would lead the raid conducted by Army Special Forces into North Vietnam at a place called Sante. Mosby was inducted into that Hall of Fame with some real heavy hitters. It's a recognition of not just Mosby, but what the Rangers had accomplished during the war as well. Now, just for your edification, the Rangers, the vast majority of the men who rode with Mosby stayed in Virginia or stayed in Maryland, but they certainly spread out literally all over the country. And not far from here is a Ranger, John Elliott Walker, who's buried in Greenwood Memory Lane Cemetery. And at the time of his death, or just prior to it, he was actually the sheriff of Maricopa County. So if you do get an opportunity to visit him, it would be great. But there's a little touch of Mosby's Rangers here in Arizona. A long way from home. I don't know how it is he ended up out here, but he certainly did. And as I said, he was the sheriff for at least one term of Maricopa County. That completes my presentation. I've been told this is the proper way to ask. What are your questions concerning what I spoke about this evening? Sir.
I don't have a clear picture of how they fought. So the engagements, when they came in a little bit, was the idea that they would hit a small Union unit and overwhelm it, and then a larger unit, a guerrilla hit and run tactic kind of thing. And what did that end up with in a casualty rate for the Rangers over the time they operated?
Well, they had it was a mixture.
Could you repeat the question just to make sure everyone hears?
I don't get it. I don't know. Right.
Their engagement. I don't
Yeah,
have a clear
how
picture
did they
how
fight?
They engaged.
How did they fight? They did a couple things. One were planned raids. They would hit places. They knew they wanted that. This was what they were going to do. They'd gather whatever number of men and hit the place. Again, it was to break things and shoot people and take horses and do whatever they could. Never to stay, never to gain the ground. So get in, throw your punches, do what it was you were going to do, and pull out. In other cases, it would be a little more on the fly Union patrol in the area. And again, this was often a patrol, unit patrol, 100, 150, 200, and maybe 50 Rangers would hit it. And again, it's just a question to get in, kill as many of them as you can, take prisoners, get whatever weapons and horses you could, and again, engage and break off. And the one standing order or standing operating procedure that the Rangers had above all else was known as the skedaddle. And once, if they hit and think, because most of the time when the Rangers would hit a Union detachment, the Union detachment would break. As the Rangers hit them, they'd kill a good number of men, wound them, take some prisoners right off, and the Union detachment, and this is not a reflection of the Union guys being cowards. It was normally surprise, and they'd be ridden down upon these guys with revolvers blazing away, and they often would break. If they didn't, and there were some cases where they didn't, if the Union cavalry said, okay, we're not going anywhere, very quickly things would turn against the Rangers because they almost always were outnumbered. They only had so many revolvers, and I don't want to be in the middle of a fight trying to reload my revolver. And they would go into the skedaddle, and that was every man for himself. They can't chase us all. So does that?
Yes, thank you. But so did they have over the course of operation a pretty low casualty rate then?
There were a little over 100 Rangers who died. Mortally wounded, killed in action, executed, died in POW camp, or a couple died from disease. So about 100. I often say that being wounded was the cost of doing business. One of my favorite Rangers was 16 when he joined. He was shot 12 times. There's another Ranger who was shot 7. But their casualty rates were much lower than you see in these other units. And I stress this when I talk sometimes about different fights. If the Rangers had one man killed in a fight, that was a big deal. Now balance that against some of these other units in the fight where they lose 30%. If the Rangers had one man killed, that was bad. And if they had 2 or 3 or 4, and they did a few times, that was a disaster. So the casualty rates were not as high, but certainly when you look at dead, the number of guys who were captured, number wounded, you probably get close to, when you combined all those, they probably had 100% casualty rate between being wounded, being killed, and being captured. Sir.
After the war, Mosby became a Republican and was a friend of Grant. How was he treated in Virginia?
After the war, Mosby became a Republican and a friend of Grant. How was he treated? He was vilified. Nobody believed initially that Mosby was going to stump for Grant, and a good number of people turned their back on him. Mosby very much had the personality of when he made a decision, that's the way it was. That's the way I'm going. He believed Grant was a fair man, liked the terms that he had given Lee at Appomattox, and he thought Grant was the best for the South. So he was really vilified. And I think they say that many of his men turned their backs on him. I can't remember ever reading any examples of that, but I know when the Rangers had their first reunion in 1895, Mosby did attend that reunion. And the newspaper article said that when he walked into the room, the old Rangers went nuts, stood up and just, really celebrated his attendance. But yeah, because he became a Republican, as a lawyer, he lost his business in Warrenton. He was talked badly about. by some key figures. So it was a tough road to hoe for him. Sir.
I read often about him not surrendering his command afterward, but I'd also read at one point that he tried to negotiate a surrender with Hancock. Is that true, or can you speak about that?
They never got to the surrender part. There was talk back and forth. There were some truces. You know, what are we going to do? And I need some more time. And finally, he was told that's it. So they never got to the time of surrender. It was sort of, okay, let me figure this out, and finally said, okay, no more time. The main problem, or one of the sticking points, was it was told to Mosby, and it was very clear that all of his men would be given the same terms as Lee had received at Appomattox. All his men would get the same terms except for Mosby. And there was some question whether or not he was going to be arrested and tried as a war criminal. And that's one of the biggest reasons he decided to disband. He said, I can't have my men have this hanging over them. I'm no longer your commander.
Sir, over there. Is there any way to measure the effectiveness of Mosby and his contribution to the war effort?
You know, you can do a body count, but we all know those don't work. You know, in a lot of ways, he was very, very successful. If you want to go out on a limb to a certain extent, Brandy Station in June 9th of 63, Mosby had somewhere between 2 to 5 Union regiments tied up around Washington City. Would they have swung the day at Brandy Station had they been there instead of chasing Mosby? So that's an impact. He attacked Sheridan's wagon train in the fall of 64 in the valley, when Sheridan was really sort of, of course, going south in the valley is going up the valley. As Sheridan was going south in the Shenandoah Valley, Mosby hit him and scared the jeebers out of him, and Sheridan slowed down. And you could argue that Sheridan getting to Petersburg in the final parts of the Civil War were slowed down 3 to 6 months. So that was an impact. Other than that, I'm not sure if there's any way to put real numbers on it. I know it's been said that when the Battle of Cedar Creek started, as that battle, everything was starting to get to the point that the fight at Cedar Creek was going to start, there were more messages from Union commanders wanting to know where Mosby was and what he was doing than anything else. And this is from major Union units. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Sir.
Is this the reunion right here, the picture?
It's one of them, yes, ma'am.
Do you know which one?
Yeah, I've got the number at home. It actually may. This one's in Richmond on the steps of the State House. And I want to say it's about the third reunion, if I'm not mistaken. I think 1896. I just don't remember.
Did the Union raise any units to try to counter him?
The one specific unit that was formed was Blazer Scouts. They were formed in 64, and there was an Ohio captain named Richard Blazer said, "Give me 100 men with Sharps or Spencers, I forget which, and I'll wipe Mosby out." And he actually they were pretty effective initially. He did a good job. And as far as counterinsurgency, this is another guy who got it. He knew how to do it. And so he had some successes against, not Mosby personally, but against some Ranger detachments. And then finally Mosby said, all right, that's enough. And he sent a group of Rangers out, the White Boys or Scouts out. But that was probably the one real effort to counter Mosby. And the thing that I found to this day find interesting is if they had replicated Blazer, 3, 4, 5 different units. Again, it was only 100 men in the unit. The Union Army certainly had the bodies. Had they replicated that unit and spread them around Mosby's Confederacy and kept them in the field, they would have pushed Mosby pretty hard. But when Blazer was wiped out, that was it. They forgot about it and moved on. Sir.
So they never engaged in set piece battles. They never engaged in set piece battles. Is that correct?
Say again?
They never engaged in formal set
So they never engaged in a set piece battle.
The question was, did they ever engage in a set piece battle? And none that I can think of. You know, they
So it was hit and run, they melded back into the population. They lived among the citizens of whatever town it's from. But it'd be wrong to call them guerrillas rather than rangers.
No, I mean, they used guerrilla tactics. And Mosby said he didn't have any problem in calling it. And they again, they used tactics. But, you know, again, essentially, they were Mosby's Rangers. Now, they called themselves Mosby's men. Not a lot of them referred to themselves as Rangers. That would be because of the Partisan Ranger Act. Calling them Rangers was popular.
Was he married? Did he have family?
He was married to a woman named Pauline. He'd been married before the war. He was born in 1833. When the war started, he already had a couple of kids. They would go on to have 6 children that lived. The 7th lived a little less than a year, and then an 8th would actually, Pauline would die in 1876 from the effects of the birth when he was a child.
Yeah.
1916.
1916.
1916.
Anybody else with one more question here?
No, I was.
Right behind you.
Yeah, I wanted that person to open.
Was Mosby at Cedar Creek?
No.
Where was he in Cedar Creek?
No.
You know where he was?
He
was in the Confederacy?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I mean, he was still back probably in Loudon, Buckland, I think he actually had he was doing some things very close to Cedar Creek as well. So he was still doing raids.